Hey everyone, welcome to another edition of Ask an Anthropologist about world building. And today I have a special guest, my co-author, very brilliant co-author on our book Build Better Worlds: An Introduction to Anthropology for Game Designers, Fiction Writers, and Filmmakers. Kyra earned her bachelor's degree in anthropology from Metropolitan State University of Denver, as did I. It's where we met. And she got her master's degree in forensic anthropology from the University of Edinburgh. She published an article in the Applied Anthropologist, Forensic Anthropology and Facial Reconstruction as Applied Anthropology. She's now a full-time professor at Front Range Community College, and she's taught at many other universities in the Denver area, where she makes courses on biological anthropology, human evolution, forensic anthropology, and medical anthropology. She also teaches archaeology, cultural anthropology, and other kinds of stuff, right? You have a passion for teaching, and like me, we both love kind of the interactive focus on gameplay, multimedia, that kind of teaching. So thanks for coming today, Kyra, and answering people's questions about forensics and biology, biocultural interaction, and anything else anyone might want to ask about world building. So our first question for our guest is, what is your bones to pick about fictional world building, or I mean, in your case, like CSI? What kind of things do you frequently see that you think that people should be aware of that is definitely problematic in writing fiction?
Let's see. I've been thinking about this question for a couple days, and I didn't pick up on your pun about the bones to pick. So I was just sort of thinking of general things, but thinking of like from a kind of like a biological and an ecological and like forensics point of view. Well, let's see. Do you want to start with like more fantasy stuff, or do you want to start with like murder mystery CSI stuff?
Ooh.
Because you asked kind of both of those.
Yeah. Let's start with the CSI kind of stuff, because that's definitely an area I don't know very well.
Well, honestly, so since I work in such a limited kind of capacity within the forensics field, there's not all like I'm not like a CSI person, but I do kind of work within that forensics field and that kind of medical legal context, or I have in the past. So if anybody has questions about like very specific like fingerprinting or thing, I don't know any of that, but um, I do see a lot of I don't know. It's all very inaccurate. All of the depictions of like forensic anthropology in fiction, and I love Bones. Don't get me wrong; it's a very fun show. Um, but they kind of they tell you, or they learn a lot more from the skeleton than we can actually learn, and they kind of learn it very quickly. Like Temperance Brennan will just kind of glance at a skeleton and tell you like what they were doing for the last 6 weeks of their life and like how old they are and their age and or sorry their sex. I have a cold, so I'm very space cadetty today. Please forgive me. Um, and she just kind of like immediately gets all those things. And some of that stuff we can learn absolutely. Like we can absolutely tell the sex of a skeleton, the age of a skeleton. Um, we can't do it just at a glance, or at least we shouldn't do it just at a glance. You always want to double check your work. And the thing that really drives me nuts is they always have some sort of like deus ex machina brittle bone disorder, so they can tell exactly like what that person was doing in their life and like their exact career and like exactly what happened to them, like the injury that killed them. Like it's all very beautifully clear on the skeleton. And unfortunately, like I know why they do that because it makes for good fiction, but it's not how it works in the real world, and it always makes me a little bit insane
Well, what
because
is it
nobody
like?
breaks bones that easily.
Yeah. What is it like working in a forensic anthropology lab where you're looking at bones?
It, I mean, I always really liked it. It's not very glamorous. Um, Obviously, like in the shows, it's very big and shiny, and they've got like 3D modelers, like holographic modelers and things. We definitely don't have that. It's usually um, so the ideal kind of version of that, the whole investigation would be you. go out with the police or the investigating organization, and then you do the collection in the field, then you bring it back to the lab. And I've worked on quite a number of those, and like I said, it's never as glamorous. Like you're out at like crack of dawn in somewhere that's not very hospitable. It's usually like freezing cold or super duper hot, and it's a very very long day of work. And then our labs, it's often like the county coroner's office or like the morgue or a basement somewhere. It's a lot of I really enjoy that kind of lab work. I don't get to do it as much, but it's definitely not as fancy as you see on television.
Yeah, I know it's almost like you're watching this thing and you're like, "What is this, Star Trek?" Like it's
Yeah,
like you
exactly.
can't just magnify stuff like that. That's not how anything works. So
Nope.
so all right, well, what are some bones to pick you have about like fantasy?
I was thinking, cause so you'd asked me some kind of like an idea of the questions there, and we're asking about like one of the ones you asked was how do writers kind of depict the evolution of organisms, and they never do, and that's one of my bones to pick is like basically all of the humanoids are just kind of like humans with like feathers on or something, like kind of a very humanoid sort of shape, but they don't really talk about like why that kind of adaptation might have existed. They often don't talk about like kind of the unique like biological needs or tendencies
Hmm.
of those different races of people, like humanoid races. Cause like surely if you had wings, like your clothing would have to be different, right? You couldn't just fit wings under a t-shirt, or if you've got a tail, like chairs would have to be different. If you know, if you're like a mer people or something and you're walking around on land, you'd have to have higher levels of humidity. Like the authors never really address kind of the necessity of those adaptations and why they exist and how they would kind of work in a real world.
Yeah, and it's really it actually I think makes for better conflict in storytelling. So I just finished yesterday Project Hail Mary, which has been on like my reading
Oh
list for a
yeah,
while. Have you read that one?
I've not. We're gonna go see the movie soon because it looks really good. But everyone's been raving about this book for weeks and weeks.
Yeah. So I went and saw Project Hail Mary, and they did the exact thing you're just talking about. Is he goes through the various reasons that this other alien evolved in an ammonia atmosphere. Like he gives you the actual. I mean, this is like it's like he read our book. Except he probably, I think he published it before we published our book, but
Yeah,
but
he's been doing it for a long time.
he's been doing it for a while, yeah, and he's very good scientist. So, or at least I don't know what his background is, but either way, so you have this creature Rocky, and like he explains like his sleep cycle and why it's that way, and why he doesn't have a immune system, and all kinds of really interesting things. Why his species doesn't know about certain kinds of technology, but humans do. I mean, it's a really excellent depiction of applying real biocultural interaction stuff. Because even the spaceship is matches the biology. I was like really impressed with how well done the whole situation was. And the book was like a page turner. I just couldn't stop reading it. But I wanted to finish it before I saw the film because that's just how I am. Um, Anyway, we do have one question from Facebook. And if anyone else has questions here, just go ahead and put them in the chat and we'll do our best to answer them. Our theme today is biology in the body. So, thinking about biocultural interaction, thinking about evolution, fossils, forensic, those kinds of things. So that's the theme, but if you have another question, me and Kyra can also field that as well. So go ahead and put your stuff in the chat.
We
Our
can try
first,
at least.
what's
We
that?
can try at least.
We can try. We can always try, or at least work through it, right? So the first question is, and this was kind of a broad one, and they didn't give specifics exactly, but this person asked, "What are the boundaries of biology in terms of like evolution and development?" And so I guess, and then maybe throw in a little like what kind of cultures would pop up around some of those kind of maybe those limitations. What kind of things can and can't we do?
Oh man, I mean, honestly, like if you're just talking about kind of the boundaries of biology, I'm not sure there are boundaries to it, which is really cool. And I think we tend to kind of stick within our own like sphere of knowledge. So like organisms are like carbon based and breathe oxygen or air, and they have to consume like specific types of food and like certain numbers of calories and like have to have sleep cycles and stuff. And it's really a shame that we're sort of stuck in that because there's so much cool stuff in the realm of biology. Like I was reading a book the other day about the extremophiles, like bacteria that live in the crust of the earth, and like they wouldn't even notice if the sun exploded. Like as long as the planet was still here, they would be fine. They do chemosynthesis instead of photosynthesis, so they don't need light. They use the kind of chemicals that are coming up through the mantle of the earth.
Whoa.
That is as much as I can describe that. That book was a bit over my head in terms of the chemistry. But like that's crazy that there are organisms that don't even need the sun at all on a planet
Mm-hmm.
that we think of as being very sun centric. There's so many different like biological structures and like ways things are so complicated. Like there's I don't know, there's so much variety in biology and biological organisms that I genuinely don't think there is a boundary. You could
Really? Okay.
figure out anything, and some organism probably just on our planet already has already thought of this and is doing this. Not thought of it
Yeah,
obviously, but has it as a feature.
there's certainly a lot of like science fiction out there that plays with those ideas. I read, I think it was Robert Ford, his name, wrote a book called Dragon Egg, and it's like life evolving on a neutron star. And
Oh yeah.
it was really, they're like these little tiny little very tiny things, and like for them time is like, I mean they encounter, there's a human spaceship that comes in, and like just between communications is like a generation, so it's, like concepts of time and all kinds of fun stuff. I mean, yeah, and you have tardigrades too. So
You have lichen that can live on the outside of the International Space Station, and lichen is
really.
actually like a symbiotic relationship. Lichen is not an individual organism,
Hmm. i
which is
did
cool.
i
Like,
did know that.
yeah, it's three organisms in a trench coat pretending to be a singular thing.
So a gestalt species, as it were.
Basically, yeah.
Yeah. Better together, as it were. Yeah. So you don't think that? I mean, it'd be really. I mean, like, how could you ever know? But it'd be really interesting to like play with the idea of life at the edge of a black hole or something like that at the event horizon, or what would that look like, or all kinds of fun stuff. Let's see. I have another question here. Um, if you are building a non-human species, what's the first biological question you should be asking?
Oh goodness, that's a great one. I would say probably first is how you get your food, because that they like what do they eat? That makes the most like that's the thing we need pretty much constantly. So like food and water, or whatever, like however that works in your species. Um, After that, excuse me, I would think of probably like the environment they need to survive in. Like, are they a warm weather species or a cold one? Do they breathe air or do they breathe water? Are they, I guess, like then like daytime dwelling or nighttime dwelling? We call that diurnal or nocturnal. And then from there, you can kind of get into all those more fun details about like what do they look like? Because that's kind of what we think of first as like the image of the organism. But
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I would think of kind of what they need to survive, and then you can kind of build off of that, and that gives you a really solid base too, because like I mean humans, most of the stuff we do is centered around like getting food or water or like sleeping or keeping our temperatures regulated. It's like clothes and like air conditioner units, things like that. So I think that's probably your best bet is to start at the bedrock level and kind of build up.
Yeah, I would think, and right, and so culture is an adaptation of to the physical and social environment, right? We develop certain
Yeah.
practices and ideas to protect ourselves and propagate and continue on. And so, after you're thinking about those basic needs, it makes sense to be like, okay, well, now what does it look like? And then what do they need to make? what kind of tools. I mean, assuming you're talking about a intelligent species, there's certainly lots of like, Avatar: The Last Airbender just loves to just throw in mixes of different creatures in their world and stuff, which is a lot of fun and cute and stuff. But if you're talking about an intelligent species, I would say, yeah, you would also need to think about what kind of tools do they need? What tools, what senses do they have? Children of
Yeah.
Time is another a great example. Have you read that one, Children of Time?
I have not.
So it's an uplift book. So it's like they're trying to experiment with seeing how evolution actually happens. So they terraform this whole planet, and then right as they're like about to seed the planet with this primate, they were a group of monkeys, and then watch how they develop and uplift because they made a retrovirus that could make them develop really fast. So they're about to release that. The monkey ship gets blown up by like this cult faction, and the cult faction fractures the human galactic empire, but the virus gets released on the planet. And so
Oh
a
no.
whole bunch of species on the planet get uplifted, but the one that kind of becomes dominant is a spider species. And they're really
Sounds more
cute. They're
challenging
jumping
than I thought.
spiders. They're jumping spiders. They do the little dance, the little tap dance and everything, right?
Okay,
But
those are pretty cute.
yeah, yeah, and then they use ants as computers. They actually figure out how to engineer pheromones to create ant computers. And it was just really interesting to think about the tools and the language that he did such a great job of thinking about biocultural interaction. It was just like, like in this case, for example, the females kill their male mate. So the males are like passive and submissive and much smaller, and so there has to be kind of like a male revolution for gender rights in the case of the
Yeah,
spider
they
species.
presumably have to, yeah, have some way to like keep themselves safe, so they probably have like,
They have like passed laws because the women historically eat the males.
yeah, absolutely.
And then
But
like the sequel is like a sentient octopus species, and then there's like this amoeba slime mold mix, and then the third book is ravens, and then and then the fourth one just came out. So it's that one's like I think a really good case study in what you can do with biocultural interaction, and he did a really good job of thinking about those things.
yeah,
Uh,
and I think honestly, people forget you got to start from the ground up for culture. We like to think about things like their religion and yeah, what they look like and their like customs and things. But if you start from the ground, it'll give you a better foundation.
yeah, absolutely. Like a human monotheistic religion probably wouldn't make sense in like a gestalt lichen sentient species,
Exactly,
so
because what is one deity? You can't like a single mind in a collective of minds wouldn't make any sense. So having a single deity wouldn't make a lot of sense either.
exactly. So the culture is naturally going to reflect the biology in a lot of ways. Let's see. We have another question. Um, Pretty classic question. Can biology determine culture, or does it just set edges of what's possible?
Interesting. Well, I think it. Let's see. When we're talking about determined, do we mean like can we go beyond our biology? Like, does biology limit our culture, or does biology build our culture? Which question or like which direction are
Mm.
we going?
Let's do both.
All
Let's do
right.
both.
So as far as well, building, we were just kind of talking about that, right? Like we build our cultures around what we need, so we have to have those things built in, and I mean we do it even in more places than we tend to think too. Like I mentioned, things like clothes. That's a biological necessity for humans. We came from a very warm environment. Now we live in all these different environments, and we're very sensitive to the sun. Like we need clothing to be able to survive. So we have to have that built in, or some kind of like temperature control. And then as far as like biological limitations on culture, I mean, there definitely have to be some, right? Like we can't, our food culture can't include things we can't eat or can't
Mm-hmm.
digest. So that has to be kind of a limitation. Um, Technologically, I don't know that we necessarily have that, at least not anymore. Like, because now we're starting to get into like Wi-Fi and computers and all these things that like are way beyond the bounds of what we've had in the past. So like, there's theoretically no upper limit on like what we can invent and what we can use, but it does still, I guess, have to kind of be biologically accessible in some cases. I don't know if that made any sense.
Yeah, no, and I would also think that our technology would be limited to our senses in a lot of ways, right? And now, of course, we've invented a lot of tools that expand our senses these days, like certain kinds of telescopes or microscopes or various other things. But even then, there's still things that we cannot, that maybe things that we would not think of because the way our biology and our brain structure works, and we have certain kinds of biases, certain kinds of questions we wouldn't necessarily ask. Um,
Yeah, absolutely. Because yeah, we are limited by the bounds of our senses, and yeah, you like we can do things to increase them. Like I was reading a whole book on bats and how they were trying to like determine whether they were using echolocation or not. And they're of course in the like 80s are coming up with these crazy tools, and now you can just have like an app on your phone and it will hear bats calling. But physically we can't hear that. But we still can't necessarily experience the world outside of hearing that. And like when we're seeing things, like if we're looking through a telescope, we're still kind of limited by our eyes and the way that our brain can like process that information. So yeah, there's probably a good number of things like what is it, magnetoperception, I think is what it's called. I might be wrong on that. But like the ability to sense magnetic fields,
mhm. Like
we
birds.
don't. Yeah, like birds or some, a couple of mammals do it too, but like we don't have the capability to do that. So we don't know what it would feel like to do that. So we are kind of yeah limited by what we can perceive. And there's
Yeah,
probably a whole range of like realm of experiences way beyond us.
yeah. I mean, I know like my brother has definitely no sense of magnetism because he gets lost if like in a paper bag. So,
Yeah, some people are
um,
better navigators than others.
yes, yeah, for sure. Um, yeah. Uh, and then the other side of the question.
Which was the other side of the question? So
Right.
like,
So it was the question of like the limits of culture, biology, and culture. So, I guess like the other side would be biological determinism, right?
oh, like the are you destined to have a certain type of culture based on your biology, or
Yeah.
like I don't know. That's a really good question, and I'm not sure because that's another one where we're kind of limited, right? So like as humans, we've built our culture around like specific needs and like our specific physicality, and other species like you mentioned sentient cephalopods like octopus, they might develop culture in a completely different way, and it probably would be limited by their biology to a certain extent, but it would definitely be different than ours and different than our biology.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that one's Children of Ruin, I think is the second book. And that one is they build like these spaceships that have an ocean inside, right? They have ocean conditions
Awesome.
because you have to take it with them, and then they have two parts to their language. The first is like noises, but the second is colors to emphasize the
Yeah.
noises because that's what how octopi are. So they have like a dual language structure, which I thought was like a really interesting idea to play with.
Yeah, or even if you've got species with extra senses, because our language is primarily visual and audible,
Hmm.
but you could also have like chemical types of language. Like we think ants might communicate chemically.
Hmm.
You could have like vibrational types of language, which I guess kind of might fall into the category of sound, but like I'm thinking of like beyond or maybe below the level of like audible sound. You could have
Like
like
graboids.
yes, exactly. Yeah, like sensing vibrations in the ground. Like you could have lots of elements of language and communication, like even like smell. We don't Humans don't think of communicating by scent or by chemical, but a huge number of animals do that. Like you could
Hmm.
theoretically just like people around you could know that you're stressed, or you could alter your tone of voice by like changes in pheromones or hormones, things like that.
Yeah. Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah, that'd be a really interesting idea to play with, like, a species that like emits a certain scent, and like their tone is just flat, but then whatever scent they admit is like something that that indicates their emotion or their state of mind or
Yeah,
when they're
like they could
using
be
those
yelling
words.
or flirting or something, and you could tell that by the like chemical sensors or like scent sensors, things like that.
Yeah, that would be really interesting. That would be really interesting. Yeah, and then I guess also like when we're talking about biological determinism, it's kind of important to say that like, the idea that a certain group of human is better at something inherently than another, that's all just nonsense. That's not
Yeah, that
really a
all
thing.
that all comes from this idea of like the great chain of being, and
Yeah,
this idea that there's like this idea of determinism, like in a broad sense, this idea that cultures are striving to be what we would think of as culture. And of course, the people who came up with this, they were, culture was striving to be like London, England, or Paris, France. That's what
right.
they thought of as like the ultimate evolutionary goal of things. But there isn't a goal in evolution. Like there's no, we're not trying to get anywhere. We're just doing our best. And
Right.
so there could be all sorts of different things like, like with cephalopods or ants or things, like they might not have cities in the same way that we do. They might have a completely different way of interacting with each other or a different way of living and different types of religion. And yeah, there's no real goal. There's no real end marker there, which I think is really, really cool. Oh, my dogs are here.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think it's also just sapiens.org, which is apparently they're shutting down on their website. I was looking
Oh,
at the other day.
oh, that's so sad.
I know. So if you guys are watching and don't know, sapiens.org is going to remain an archive, but it's a great kind of journalistic series, all written by anthropologists, sharing research that makes it publicly accessible. Both me and Kyra use their articles in classes sometimes because they're fun and there are lots of really interesting case studies. They have a really great article on there called "The Myth of the Black Athlete." And just talking about like this idea, that just because like you're African descended, you're inherently better at athletics than anyone else. Like that's a positive stereotype, but it's also bullshit. It's what you have to think of is that like a lot of the one of the reasons that people are in superior in those circumstances is because like Jackie Robinson had to be the best of the best in order to get past the racism and discrimination that would prevent him from just being an average player. So like black athletes have to be exceptional because of systemic racism, in other words. So it looks like they are inherently better, but like when you actually look at the statistics, they're no better or worse than any other population. So,
Yeah, it's all cultural positioning. Like if you put that same person in a different context where he can just play a sport and not have to worry about like being better than everybody else just to earn a place at the table. Like you got a place at the table already set, might be a totally different scenario there. And like we see it too, like there's plenty of cultures that they run all the time or are like very, very physically active, and people from those areas tend to make really, really good athletes
yeah,
because it's part of the culture. And your average like American just sort of sitting around here, it's like if your culture is like sitting or doing something with your hands, you're not going to be as good at like running long distances. But yeah,
right.
there's less biology than we tend to think in cultural differences.
And it's social adaptations. If like for the Kalenjin, for example, which are I believe they're a Kenyan tribal organization, but the Kalenjin or ethnic group. For them, running is like the center of their culture and has been for a long time. And if you have to be a good runner to have a mate, and so for over the several thousand years, the best runners were the ones who got the most reproductive access. So there's a kind of social selection going on, which is why the Kalenjin are like very often top contenders in the Olympics. So there's like these really like certain cultures kind of have the biology gets funneled into certain ways through the cultures so that it gets selected for and that you get certain focuses. The same thing is true with like Chinese exams is another great example. Like you get the myth of the Asian stereotype, right? But that's not biology. That's many, many, many years of selection of having greater access to society. Like I think the Chinese exams are like 2,000 some years old. And so you've had like constant cultural selection for basically standardized testing. So for
Yeah,
thousands of
and then it
years.
and then it becomes built in. So if you know that that's what's going to happen, like you're going to be training your whole life in order to be able to take that test, and yeah, then you become good at it just by being enculturated within that system.
Right. And they have like different study techniques and all kinds of things that you wouldn't have in like Europe if you had came from a many generations of farmers or blacksmiths or anything, right? So it's such an interesting thing to think about, like how cultures select who's successful then creates more kind of cultural preferences or specificity or
Yeah,
skills.
yeah, absolutely.
Um, let's ask another question.
Sure.
Hmm. We have one. Can you give an example where biology and culture are so intertwined you can't generally separate them?
Oh gosh. Okay. That's a very tricky one, honestly. Um, in broad senses, sort of like, gosh, I don't know. I'm not sure if there is an example of that. Like, because we talked about things like, we need food and sleep, things like that. Those are like fairly big necessities. I'm not sure you can necessarily pull those out. But even in that case, like sleep. So we all need to sleep, right? And we actually don't really know why we have to sleep, like why organisms do this. We think it's like maybe a reset cycle or like a recharge cycle. But so like we all have sleep built into our cultures, like roughly 8-ish hours, maybe between 6 and 10, call it. But even that we sort of structure differently. So in
Mm-hmm.
places where it's really, really hot, you tend to get like, we'll sleep during like the wee hours, and then we'll take a nap during the hottest part of the day. So you get that same amount of sleep, but it's adjusted for the culture. Or like now that we have artificial light, we tend to lump all of our sleep together into 8 hours. But even like cultures that didn't have the midday napping break, there's some like evidence, historical documentation that people used to sleep in kind of bursts. So you'd sleep for a little while, you'd kind of wake up in the middle of the night and have this sort of like limited activity period and then go back to sleep. And we've actually been able to kind of recreate that with people in like candlelit situations. So with no artificial light, they kind of sleep the same way.
Mm-hmm.
So even something as fundamental and like daily as sleep, we've adjusted for our cultures and we've adjusted the schedules for our cultures.
Yeah, and I was rereading How Forests Think by Eduardo Kohn, and his book talks about the Runa, and the Runa sleep in only a couple hours here and there. Like people are up and down and moving around, and they're in the Amazon. So like in a situation where you're in the jungle, and like you always want someone awake and alert in case there's trouble, a jaguar, a snake, whatever it is. You always want someone kind of alert and awake and moving around. And so a lot of those cultures in certain environments, I think, have very different sleep patterns. So yeah, absolutely. I would argue for humans, it's language sort of where you can't separate culture from biology because our brains are structured for language. But
That's a
like
fair one, actually. That could be true. Because yeah, we are very much structured for language, and regardless of what type of language, obviously there's tons and tons of different types of them, and they sound different. They're signed languages, but they all still process the same way. Like it works the same way in our brain.
yeah,
That's a
they're all
solid one. I
still
do like.
symbols.
Yeah, I think you might be onto something with that one there.
That's the only one I can think of though with this question. So,
Yeah, that's a tricky one.
It
So
is.
like it's in there, but I don't know if like we can also adjust our culture, and then it'll often adjust our biology too once we do that. So
Right, right. And I guess the senses in general are just kind of back to that, like we were talking about earlier. Like the sense perceptions are super important for, how we develop culture.
yeah.
Here's a really interesting one. I guess you'd have to think of like in terms of aliens or elves or something. Can forensic anthropology work on a non-human species?
Well, so technically, anthropology is the study of humans. So if we're being very nitpicky and pedantic, no. But if we're broadening a little bit, yes, you could absolutely do that. So forensic anthropology is basically just the study of like the bone tissue and kind of what we can learn. And specifically with forensics, we're usually trying to like figure out who the person is, we figure out what happened to them, how they died, how they lived through their life if we can. And any creature with like I guess with hard body parts, so like bones or like a keratinous shell or something that would survive the decomposition process, you could absolutely do that same thing with.
So just
So,
fossil. It has to leave some sort of fossil behind. Is that
yeah, it has to leave some sort of fossil behind.
okay? Okay. Let's talk about evolution. Um, we kind of touched on it a little bit in the beginning with your bones to pick. But what's the biggest mistake fiction writers make when designing an evolutionary process?
I don't know that they often do design evolutionary processes, or when they do, there is kind of this. I think they start from the beginning and work, or the end and work backwards. So
Hmm.
they start with the idea of the organism and then try to figure out why it evolved that way, which it sometimes totally works because that's kind of how we have to do it in real life, right? Is try to figure out how we evolved by looking at ourselves and then getting clues backwards. Um, but you can definitely make missteps with that, and there can be some things that I don't know, some things that just don't seem correct. Like,
Hmm.
why would this have evolved? How does this fit? Like, I don't know. There's gaps you can make if you start kind of from the end and go backwards.
Yeah, there's a lot of like creatures, like even in Star Trek, where you're like, why would they evolve that? Like, what's the
Yeah,
reason?
like why would that be a thing? I'm not complaining about humanoids with wings. I love me a good shadow daddy with wings or whatever it is, but like it just doesn't make a lot of sense. Like why would we have like first of all that's a second or a third set of limbs, so we'd be six-limbed organisms, and like why would you have evolved that and then also still look like humans?
Yeah, and also, if I'm correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't there like an energy problem when you start adding limbs?
Yeah, yeah, there's definitely an energy problem, especially like the mechanics of flight. Like all the organisms that we know of that fly are very, very light organisms. So like something with the body plan of a human, like we would not be good at flying. We'd be too heavy for it. We wouldn't like we're way too long, top to bottom, to be able to fly like that.
I
So
would
yeah,
imagine you wouldn't be a very good fighter either because you'd be like you might have claws, I guess, but like you'd be pretty brittle, right? Because your bones would not be because and your hide wouldn't be able to be as thick. That's right, right?
yeah, generally, yeah. The bones of so like birds and bats, their bones are very, very, very thin and very, very light. And birds obviously have the kind of hollow bones. They're not literally hollow, but they're much more hollow than ours. So yeah, and like you wouldn't necessarily have like the ability to have the musculature that humans have with their bone density, and then also still be able to fly. So yeah, it's a huge energy issue.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and I would just think also just thinking about your brain structure, like you have a certain, your brain matches the number of limbs you have, it matches like
Yeah,
your organs, like those things did not evolve separately, they evolved at once. And so you would have a completely different organ system. Your brain, your senses would probably be different just from having wings, all kinds of stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And like I said, I'm not picking a fight with the wings. It's, you know, the fairies and stuff. That's great. I enjoy it absolutely. But yeah, if we're talking from an evolutionary sense, it does not make any sense at all.
Yeah, I mean, there's a reason it's called fantasy, right?
Absolutely.
Let's see. Okay, this is an interesting question. What are all the things that you can tell about someone and what their life was like just based on a skeleton?
Oh, I love this one. So I mentioned like we can tell sort of your basic like we call the biological profile. So the stuff that like you'd fill out on like a missing persons form or like a dating profile or something. Like we can tell the height. Height is really easy and accurate. We can tell sex. Sex is decently accurate. We like I don't know. There's so much overlap and variety in humans that it makes it a little bit difficult to tell. But we can get that with a decent degree of accuracy. Age is tricky. We can tell age extremely accurately, starting from like basically as soon as your bones develop in utero, all the way up until you basically finish growing. That's all very accurate. After that, it's just kind of a slow process of breaking down, which anybody who's over 30 is like, yep, absolutely. So it gets less accurate over about 2023 maybe. And then other stuff we can tell this is hard. Like you have to get kind of lucky to be able to tell some of these things, but you can tell sometimes what jobs people had during life. So like weavers, so weaving is kind of very similar all across the world. Like you usually have the what's it the warps and wefts? Yeah, warp and weft. So warps go down and wefts go this way, I think. Um, but usually, so you got the ones coming down here, and then you kind of thread the thing through, and then you kind of pull it down to tighten it. So we can tell people who are weavers and spinners because they have like ridges on the bones of their fingers from this motion constantly.
Really?
Uh, yeah, it's just like little ridges because the muscles kind of pull down as they pull on the edges of the bone there. So you can, it's a very distinctive sort of trait. Things like squatting, so they're like there are cultures who sort of squat to sit down, um, so instead of just sitting, you know, the flat foot sort of squat, or cultures that squat to like process food, so like grinding flour on like a mano with a metate, or on a metate with a mano. You can see that because it actually changes the shape of your ankle bones
Hmm.
over time, and things like different levels of arthritis. Archers, this is one of my favorite ones, and also people love an archer in a fantasy story. Archers develop distinctly different bone shapes on the sides of their body.
Really?
Um, yeah, there's one very famous example is from Stonehenge. They found him in like I've got the set for my students. You can see like his right clavicle and left clavicle, and like so the collarbones, like the humerus and the bones of the wrist and the arm, and they're different. Like the collarbones, they look like they're from two different people. It's crazy. And the bones of one arm are actually longer and thicker than the bones of the other arm, and probably because he was a professional archer. And yeah, because you're pulling all the time, so you develop this incredible musculature, and the muscles are pulling in different ways. So yeah, it looks like the skeleton's like two separate people stuck into one person. So
Is
if we're
that
very
also
lucky, we
true?
can tell those things.
Is that also true for like a knight with riding a horse? Do we see any kind of different things in the hips from long-term horse riding?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you do it long enough, you actually can develop a bit of a bend in the legs. Like if you think of a cartoon cowboy and they've got like the bow legs, you actually can start to see the bend in the femur over time.
Hmm.
And there's also it's I think it's called a rider's mark or rider's bone, something like that. There's a muscle attachment in the femur because if you're on a horse, you're kind of constantly like pulling your legs together like that to hold on. So the
Mm-hmm.
muscles, they're called the adductor muscles. They're pulling really hard on one portion of the bone, and we can actually see that it creates like a little, almost like a bone spur in that
Wow.
region.
Wow. Yeah. Man, I just think about like sailors. I think about all these different groups that they would have to change their musculature over time to adapt to a different situation. I had never thought of that before. Interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, if your career is physical enough or has like a specific motion that you do, we can see that if we know where to look for it for sure.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
What else can you tell from the body?
Oh boy. Um, we can kind of tell ethnic origin, although this is a bit of a thorny subject.
Hmm.
Um, Forensic anthropologists in America learn how to do this because American police will ask you for that sort of data. So, like,
Hmm.
was this person black or white or Asian? So we have to figure that out from the skeleton. It's got some problems. Like, we need more data. If
Hmm.
any future forensic anthropology students are listening to this, like, we need more data on how to be able to tell different groups apart. But we actually do have a pretty good method with we take measurements on the skull and feed it into a statistical analysis program, and then
Hmm.
we kind of compare those measurements to different kind of more traditional ethnic groups. Like, I think most of our data points for that are a couple hundred years old, which actually
Hmm.
kind of works because then we don't have as much kind of admixture between groups. So we can tell a little bit of origin that way. If we look at the isotopes in the body, we can tell where you grew up and where you spent the last about 6 to 10 years of your life, which is really cool.
Is that just an isotopic analysis? Is that what it is?
Yeah, yeah. So how this works is, and this doesn't work so much in the modern era because like I'm drinking fruit juice right now, and those fruits probably came from all over the hemisphere, if not all over the world. So it doesn't work now, but in the past, you're eating things that are in your local environment, and kind of through the food chain, like the primary producers, like the plants, they're picking up like isotopes, so different versions of molecules in the environment, and then the things that eat them get those molecules, and then they get into us, and they're actually built into then the structure of our bones and our teeth. And if you look at the teeth, because your teeth grow when you're a child, and this is the only set, right? Like your adult teeth, that's all you get. They don't regenerate themselves like other tissues. We can look at the isotopes and tell what region of the world you were living in while your teeth were developing, so like where you grew up. And then if you moved, like the archer I was just talking about, actually, I think it was the archer, somebody at least in that cemetery, if it's not exactly him, we know that they were an immigrant to Britain because they had a different isotopic signature in their teeth versus in their bones, because their bones are regenerating. So he'd spent the last several years of his life in Britain, and then obviously was buried in Stonehenge. So we know he was not necessarily a recent immigrant there either. He had been there for quite a long time.
So you can actually like use the teeth as like a control sample of region and then measure that against the regular bones. Is that correct?
Yeah, totally. So like, did you die in the same place you grew up? Basically, like as an
Okay.
adult, did you live in the same place that you grew up?
But I mean, so obviously there are similar regions around the world too, though. So does that complicate things? So if like you're talking about some place in like South America versus Sub-Saharan Africa, where you have similar kinds of of environments, essentially like jungle, is there
Yeah,
overlap there, or can you easily tell because of like the particular kinds of foods in the region?
man. Now we're getting into some areas where I'm a little fuzzy. So we're in like more molecular anthropology here, but there are definitely overlaps. So like a jungle is a good example of this. Like the plants in a jungle usually have the same types of isotopes in them. There are ways to tell more specific regions, but like I said, we're getting more into kind of more molecular and chemistry stuff than I tend to deal with. So you can tell the differences, but don't ask me for specifics.
What about skin color? Can you tell skin color based on
From a
bones?
skeleton? No. Well, not really. If you have a good enough DNA sample, you can do it
Well, yeah, because you just draw out
because it's DNA. But yeah, so
because it's
you
DNA.
cannot
Yeah.
tell skin color from bones. You can tell it from DNA if you know what you're looking for, but not from the bones themselves.
Cool. Well, we have about 10 minutes left. So I kind of wanted to like make this like, so we've got a lot of facts for people to play with. But what are some things that if you're building a fictional world, what kind of things do you think are most useful when it comes to like biological anthropology to be considering? I mean, I know we already talked about basic needs, but are there other things that people should be thinking about when they're building their fictional world, whether it be like orcs or elves or aliens or extra dimensional beings or I don't know, ghosts, whatever.
Yeah, yeah. So I think obviously the biological needs for sure. Um, Things like disease is one, and I've noticed my students doing more and more of this. Obviously, we all went through a big pandemic, and it was at a very formative period of their lives, so that disease is kind of on the brain for them. But they think about how or I guess what sorts of diseases exist within cultures, and how cultures kind of have to work around that, and the kind of structures that they might build, or like the social structures they would build to deal with that, and kind of where those diseases come from in the natural world, which is
Mm-hmm.
quite neat. This is not something I feel like we heard discussed before. Like everybody knew what a zoonotic transmission disease was, but students, they just did this a couple weeks ago for their papers. They were coming up with like, well, this culture, they're hunting in the woods, and so they come across these fungi, and so fungal illness is a very big problem with this particular culture, and
Mm-hmm.
something that's yeah, it's something that's a big part of our lives, and we don't really think about it often unless it's, so if it's like the point of the story is a plague, people will think about it, but it exists kind of all the time.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, in thinking about, I mean, very rarely in science fiction do you, unless I guess, like you said, unless the point is a plague, do people think about, the fact that you need to like quarantine and you have, like, if you go to another planet, you gotta wait for people to be in some sort of quarantine. Sometimes, like, for quite a while because you have no idea what kind of biological encounters you would have. But of course, if you're just doing soft sci-fi, you can be like Star Trek and just be like, well, the transporter takes care of all that, like,
Yeah, absolutely. There's definitely workarounds you can do there. Like, it's fine. They just don't have it. Yeah.
what else? Like, so, in our book, you did a lot of the Dungeons and Dragons stuff, right? And I know
Oh yeah.
you talked about how that's gotten better. Like, Kira is the Dungeons and Dragons nerd of the two of us. Like, I've played, but like, Kira definitely like loves Dungeons and Dragons. So, what are some kind of world building things in sort of Dungeons and Dragons or tabletop sort of situations that you think people should be thinking about when they're building campaigns?
Oh my gosh. So to kind of stick with the like my areas of specialty, because there's so many things I could like veer into cultures and religions things, but in sort of my area of specialty, um, the ecology of your world and like the amount of species, and I'm in my ecology era right now. I'm just like devouring books on ecology, and the lack of like species diversity in fiction. Like we've got a lack of species diversity in the world that we interact with because we've kind of created these spaces that
Mm-hmm.
like don't allow for other organisms, so we don't run into them a lot, so we forget about them, I think. But like come up with cool little animals and like cool monsters, and like not even just monsters, but like animals. Like what types of like grazers exist in this world, and like what types of organisms exist at night that you might be dealing with. Like do you have something that's as cool as like bats or birds? Do you have like how large have your reptiles gotten, and does the environment support that? And, like have different like critters for the different environments. So like if you go from an arctic place to like a jungle, what kinds of different creatures would there be, and would there be more or less, and how do they interact with each other, and how many of them are threatening to humans, like, or players or characters, I guess. They're non-human.
Yeah, I get really irritated when you see science fiction or fantasy and the world has like one ecological system and like
Oh, I know.
one language and like one religion and I'm just like, come on. Like you can get away with that if you're saying you're focusing on one village in that world. But like you have to deal with the fact that worlds are big.
Yeah, and there's so much diversity of like ecosystems and like niches and temperatures and all sorts of things. Yeah, people tend to focus on, mostly actually people tend to focus on like temperate plains.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That's where everybody's right. Which I mean, most human beings now live in cities in like not necessarily temperate environments, but like we're kind of built this environment around us. We don't necessarily think about all those different variations in the world, but they exist still.
Right. Yeah, yeah, and well, and of course, some science fiction really does consider. It's an old series, but the Heliconian trilogy is about a binary star system, and in the binary star system for 2,500 years is each season is 2,500 years. So
Oh,
so you have minor fluctuations in temperature, but I think if I got it was like I think I was like 19 when I read this book, so long ass time ago. I was working at a sunglass hut reading this trilogy, but like in the first book, it is about the Great Thawing, and so it's like the development of culture from like an ice age into like a much more kind of agrarian civilizations, and then they go, they're building cities, so because they're building cities, they have close contact, and because they have close contact and the world is warming up, they get a major plague towards the end of the book. And then the survivors of the plague are the ones that make the new culture for the second book, kind of thing. And it was just like a really interesting idea to play with, is that you have this, because the first book is Heliconian spring, that's Heliconian summer, and then it's Heliconian winter. And it's like and it's Brian Aldiss, who's like a British sci-fi author in like the very classic kind of British sci-fi from the 60s and 70s. But it was really interesting to kind of watch the cycles of culture. And I mean, I don't know, I should reread those because I wonder now that I have an anthropologist brain what I would think of them versus like before. I just like really thought it was really cool how like, oh, you saw the development of civilizations, but now I'm wondering how much anthropology actually goes into this versus like him just reading a couple of history books or something. So,
yeah, I was gonna say the way you described it, it sounds pretty accurate for like the way that we kind of came out of the ice age and then developed, yeah, like these more agrarian societies, and then presumably would go back in the wintertime, like you go back to an ice age situation, and you couldn't have the same sort of culture in that case. Like it
no.
wouldn't work.
No, no. I mean, yeah, you have to manage all that. I mean, what a city is just some mass management of people and energy. And if you don't have access to that people, if you don't have the access to that kind of energy, how can you sustain a city? Because cities are very costly in terms of energy and construction and time and materials and all that stuff.
Yeah.
Well, what are your final thoughts? Your final advice to world builders, with your specific knowledge, what's kind of your final things that you would want people to take away when they're building a fictional world?
Think outside the box. Like, don't just stick with what has been written before, what's been said before, what you know, because there's this just unbelievable vast array of diverse everything on the planet, and there's so many fun things you can do with that. And so like, and you could even just pick like a different setting. Like, I want to make an aquatic race of people, or I want to make a race of people who are cliff dwellers, or a race of people who only live in the clouds. Like, pick a cool spot and then kind of figure out, like, build up from there. So I guess like think outside the box and then build your foundations from like the ground up so that they make sense and they're coherent and they're logical and they hold true throughout the whole kind of functional web of that culture.
Yeah, and I also think that when you do that, you build a unique story, a unique set of characters because of the evolutionary, biological, ecological, cultural limitations that people have. They're going to have to solve problems within those unique boundaries. And that, by the way, everyone, is why we wrote Build Better Worlds, was because we were both kind of tired of seeing the same tropey European fantasy over and over and over again. And there were kind of, the same time we were writing this, some great examples of Afrofuturism coming out. And of course, there's, Octavia Butler and people like that. But they, were the minority. And so we wanted to give people kind of a resource to experiment with different cultural ideas by giving you enough information to use anthropological knowledge to construct your culture. So, which is, kind of a plug for our book. Check it out. I got a copy right here. Build Better Worlds, an introduction to anthropology for game designers, fiction writers, and filmmakers. Me and Kyra are working on some other stuff with this. I'm not going to tell you specifically what it is yet, because it's still taking shape, but we do have more stuff planned. So definitely follow what we're doing. A lot of the stuff that is in Build Better Worlds also has companion free resources on my website, Liridian's Laboratory. Thank you so much, Kyra, for coming today and taking the time. Kyra's like super busy. She has so many students. So it's a really big deal that she came today and shared all of her brilliant knowledge with us. So thank you so much, Kyra. We appreciate you.
Thanks for inviting me. This is fun.
Yeah. Have a great one.